Hello and welcome. My name is Lina Malfona. I'm an associate professor in architecture and urban design in the architecture program of the School of Engineering of the University of Pisa, where I direct this research lab, Politico, who is organizing this event. Yeah, first of all, thank you to be here. It's a pleasure to have this such an interesting panel of discussants and of experts, no, in this field of studies. We are getting used to know the work of Elisa because this is the last lecture that she gives as part of her ongoing visiting fellowship at the University of Pisa. Elisa, as you know, is an assistant professor of architecture at Georgia Institute of Technology. She studied architecture at UAV Venice, and she has been working for many years on issues of the colonization and post-colonial theory, global history and modernism, with a particular focus on the exchange between African, European, and American architecture and culture. We have also the pleasure to have with us Adedoyin Teriba, professor at Vassar College, Poughkeepsie, no, New York, and Pancho Guedes from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. After this lecture given from Elisa, our two guests will respond with comments and questions, introducing their point of view on the Elisa talk. I point out that this lecture will be broadcast through the channels of the University of Pisa, and we are recording this lecture titled Pancho Guedes and the Hybrid Architecture of Mozambique, Brazil, and Portugal. Well, to introduce this lecture series, actually, which is on decolonization practices, I want to say that this program probably is the first one in the Italian architecture school. And anyways, as architects, we continuously deal here with the topics of building communities for people coming from many countries with many sets of traditions. So I think that this discussion can enrich us a lot. And from my point of view, as a former architect and builder, I think that being an author today requires awareness and also civic responsibility, you know, in order to create a strong synergy between architects, between authors, artisans, builders, and users. And by authorship, I mean the crystallization of the designer political and social actions in architectural form, because architectural form, I think that can introduce and can induce new models of sociality and more aware forms of coexistence. So architects actually have the tool to change society, and this is a call to change it. I had the chance to build a series of houses, so I can say a community of people coming to the in particular to the Roman countryside by many cities and countries, and so I know that building communities means also building, you know, cities, neighborhoods, and also single family houses. And as the Brazilian master Paulo Mendes da Rocha claimed that private space actually doesn't exist, no, because there are only different degrees of public space in a way. So the house where we are secluded, no, in this period, in this strange period, probably is just the place from which to start this change. And building communities also and architecture, as those Elisa will talk about, means also to understand, I think, the vernacular traits can be and has to be continuously and fruitfully hybridized with all the what we can say the portable identities made up of experiences, rituals, and social practices. As I recently wrote in my book Residentialism, because as an author, I had to reconsider some of the social implication of concepts such as belonging and identity between and within the process of creating new communities. And so, in light of my personal experience as an educator, but also as an author, I think that taking roots is a very long process. It takes time. So I think that together with looking for new common grounds, we can say, we should also be available to read what is distant from us and also what is different and maybe can enrich our culture and our identities. So thank you very much to all, and thank you for being here. And so I leave the floor to Elisa, and it's a great pleasure for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Lina. It's very nice being here. Thank you for organizing the event. Thanks, Pedro and Adedoen, for joining us for the discussion afterwards. I have to say this is a research that I started while I was in the US, and my plan was to travel to Mozambique. Then in the last year, things have drastically changed, so I haven't been able to go there yet, so please forgive me about this, and take into consideration that this is my wish, my desire, and I hope to be able to go there as soon as possible. I will try to share my desktop. I have some images. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
So, today I will focus on the mobility of people and the mobility, the exchange of ideas among Mozambique, Brazil, and Portugal. And in particular, I will talk about this topic, looking at the work of Amancio Pancho Guedes. His work in the 50s and in the 60s. Some details on Guedes, for who's not familiar, let's say, with his work. He was born in Portugal, in Lisbon, in 25, and he spent most of his youth in Mozambique. He studied in South Africa and Portugal, and then he returned to Mozambique in 1950 to open a practice in Lourenço Marques, which is Maputo, today the capital, where he worked as an architect, but also as a sculptor and as a painter. In the early 60s, Guedes came into contact with Alison and Peter Smithson through the South African Theo Crosby. At the time, he was the editor of architectural design. So through the Smithson, Guedes was invited to the Tintan meeting in 62, and he became a member of the group. He acquired international fame. I'm interested in his work as he was one of the Portuguese architects in Mozambique who acted as a cultural bridge between traditions, between continents, across the Atlantic Ocean. Mozambican, Portuguese, Brazilian architectural culture had met in the process, the so-called process of creolization that followed the Portuguese occupation, colonization of the Southeast African region. We need to go back to 1492. The Catholic Church launched the mission of conversion across the globe. So the so-called evangelical mission operated hand in hand with the centuries so-called objective of gaining control of the spice trade, the lucrative Southeast Asian spice trade. The Portuguese were the first to develop the sailing ships, the carracks, you have an image here, that allow them to strike out along the west coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. They formed the first Portuguese trading settlement along the Mozambican coast in 1498. It was Vasco da Gama, the first who reached the area. It was only after the scramble for Africa after 1884 that the Portuguese increased efforts for occupying the interior of the continent. However, only after 1918, after long excruciating struggles with local peoples, that they secured political control over the Mozambican interior. The end of World War II saw the beginning of the process of modernization and transformation of the African country, especially in the last decades of the Portuguese colonization, between 45 and 74. 74 is the year of the independence war for the Portuguese African colonies. So the migration of architects and architectural ideas to and from Mozambique across the Atlantic Ocean characterized this process of modernization. The work of architects like Pancho Guedes inscribed itself in this discourse on post-war Mozambican modernization, but it also shows new aspects, exciting aspects of the process, as it affirms the centrality of the role played by a group of designers considered by traditional historiography as outsider immigrants at the periphery of the modern movement. So in the architectural work of these designers, European legacy, Brazilian knowledge, they mixed. And this combined knowledge inspired cosmopolitan perspectives, new forms, while local Mozambican traditions guided the discussion on alternatives, on new approaches. So when looking at this legacy, it is important to emphasize the connections between places and actors. I will talk about other designers, artists, builders, all actors that exchanged knowledge in the three regions. These connections, in a way, question the colonial vernacular bipolarity through the idea of transcontinental encounters. In a way, these exchanges open to wider perspectives that consider modern Mozambique as part of the same oceanic itinerary of transmission originated in Portugal and connecting Brazil. So before I go more in details about Guedes' work, I want to briefly introduce the complex legacy left in Mozambique by Portuguese and in part Brazilian traditions. The transatlantic exchange between Portuguese and Brazilian architecture reached a high point in Lisbon at the end of the 40s. The popularity of modern Brazilian design was at its apex towards and after the end of World War II. In 43, you have some images here. The Museum of Modern Art in New York held the famous exhibition Brazil Builds, in which the curators, Alice Carson, Philip Lippincott Goodwin, they investigated and canonized, in a way, Brazil's modern building campaign. If you want to read more about this, Patricio Del Real, he talks about the modernist hegemonic narrative over Brazilian ones, and it's very, very interesting what he says about this topic. But it was not only in New York City. In the same period, several architectural magazines in Europe and North America, including L'Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, Architectural Forum, Progressive Architecture, they publish articles on Brazilian architecture, which had quickly become a focus of international and modernist interests. So following these examples, in 48 and 53, Portuguese architects in Lisbon hosted two exhibitions on modern Brazilian designs. The first exhibit was organized at the Instituto Superior Técnico of Lisbon and displayed 85 modern Brazilian designs. The show was accompanied by a conference by a famous Brazilian architect and academic, Vladimir Alves de Souza. There was a great enthusiasm about the event, especially among the younger architects. The young Portuguese architect Sanchez, for example, described the modern Brazilian design of the exhibition as, and I'm quoting, the only able to offer new solutions to solve the problem of modern architecture. End of quote. The second exhibition, the one held in 1953, presented many more projects, 240 panels, with the most significant works by contemporary Brazilian architects. The display emphasized their, in a way, their European modernist depth. In both exhibitions, Brazil was interpreted, and I'm quoting again Sanchez, as a laboratory of modern architecture, where designers focus on their reaction against architecture as machine, end quote. So it is important to notice that these exhibitions celebrated the geographic expansion of post-war modernism and the connection between Brazil and Portugal, but they also exposed contradictory interests and complex Portuguese attitudes towards its former possessions and colonies. So I want to make a note here. Since the 15th century, Portuguese imperialism had displayed a precarious imbalance between policies of exploitation and the application of capitalist models, which, however, proved unable to build structural alternatives in the colonies, including Brazil, including Mozambique. Colonial authorities promoted a new social representation of themselves to minimize dissent abroad, to downplay, to hide colonial violence, and to gain approval in the motherland. So they supported the idea of a Portuguese hybrid subject, a friendly settler, in between colonizer and colonized. In reality, this representation was anchored in colonial intergroup attitudes, and in countries such as Brazil, for example, it produced an influence that remained strong even after independence and well into the post-World War II period. Portuguese, but even Brazilian architects in the former possessions were not immune to this perspective. So in 1954, Alves de Souza, the Brazilian architect, wrote, and I'm quoting, "Portugal had left its present and former colonies, Brazil included, her heritage and the drive," end quote. So 130 years after Brazilian independence, this is the kind of narrative that architects still used to sustain the idea of a Portuguese colonial legacy in Brazil and to justify in a way the new Brazilian international role. So you understand that the studies of architects' perspectives and approaches in the colonies and former possessions so these studies are even more fundamental than before. So they are studies that can unpack social asymmetries, political polarizations, and their relation with the architectural world and the colonial territories. We need to remember that in the 20th century, the idea of a new Portuguese colonial centrality had emerged. So as a result, the self-representing Portuguese image of the colonizer dangerously combined with the concept of lusotropicalism. The notion was epitomized by Gilberto Freire, the Brazilian sociologist, intellectual, and he promoted the idea of the Portuguese Empire as a multicultural, multiracial, pluricontinental entity. In effect, lusotropicalism also supported a series of unequal patterns of living, which were ordered by the priorities of Portuguese settler colonialism. Lusotropicalism established inequality through the idea of tolerance and miscegenation, so the interbreeding of people considered to be of different racial types. So these ideas supported racism. They were based on the idea of race, but they also supported a profound and pervasive blending of cultures, tropes of whiteness, and arguments sustaining the exploitation of overseas possession in South America, as well as in the other colonies. Especially after World War II, lusotropicalism broadly circulated within Portuguese society, shaping social change, but also perpetuating colonial ideologies. Antonio Yolivera Salazar, the Portuguese prime minister, de facto the dictator from the 30s to the 60s. So he supported nationalist politics as well as lusotropicalism and the idea of an unconditional unity between Sorry about this. So he supported Lusotropicalism and the idea of an unconditional unity between Portugal and the overseas territories, among them the African possessions and even Brazil. So he promoted the idea that the African colonies were provinces of Portugal and an integral part of the empire. Paradoxically, it was this notion of Portuguese Africa that transformed Mozambique into the new promised land for many left-oriented young architects and opponents of the Portuguese dictatorship, like Guedes, for example. So at the end of World War II, the political situation in Portugal had become unbearable. Salazar and the authoritarian right-wing party, the Estado Novo, the new state, they controlled and manipulated cultural life and the architectural realm. Many young architects could not express their ideas in the motherland and decided to move to the colonies, especially to Mozambique, where regime control of architecture and its practice was less prescribed and where economic conditions were favorable. Guedes gives us this wonderful description about Lourenço Marques, the capital of Mozambique. And I'm quoting, during the 50s and 60s, there was something incessant and extraordinary in the beautiful city that the Portuguese had built in less than half a century, and which they called Lourenço Marques. At that time, Mozambique was an isolated and unreal world, in which from the empire only came good news, inaugurations, and speeches. It was a world of rumors, secrets, confidences, and a growing tangle of snitches and agents. But in spite of that, everything seemed possible. End quote. The word had hardly touched southern Africa. And because Portugal had been neutral, its ports in Mozambique flourished and experienced an economic boom. So the so-called new generation of rebels, among them designers such as Guedes, they found in the Mozambican colonial cities, especially in Lourenço Marques, perfect cultural, physical conditions that allowed them to explore new approaches to architecture. Once in Mozambique, the Portuguese immigrant like Guedes imported modern practices, and they stimulated more local approaches toward design. They fought to find and, in a way, define their modern identity within the specificities of a region that was undergoing a difficult colonial process of modernization. Their knowledge of Brazilian architecture, for example, its adaptation to local cultural and landscape features, the monumentality of its design, they all provided the arguments they sought. Here you have an example by João José Tinoco in Mozambique. Sanchez himself, the young architect who talked about the exhibition, wrote that Brazilian architecture offered lessons on the perfect notion, and I'm quoting, of the union of structural principle with aesthetic balance. So indeed, according to several architects, a significant lesson conveyed by Brazilian architecture was in its use of concrete, its extraordinary capabilities, and the new architectural language developed in the process of standardization. The use of concrete with soleil, sculptural shaded systems, they traveled from Brazil and they were tested worldwide, even in Mozambique. Numerous architects modulated facades with concrete grids of diverse designs, geometries, textures, and there were solutions to ventilate interior spaces. Again, this example from Lichinga is very illuminating. Even in Mozambique, architects undertook structural experimentations and innovations in the field. From this research on the use of concrete, new forms, less tied to the right angle, less indebted to a European modernist language and culture, these new forms came into being. They gave birth to new Mozambican shapes, structures, curves, if you like. We can include this example, the Cycle Bakery in Lourenço Marques. Guedes designed the bakery in 1945, 5 years after his return to Mozambique. The bakery has a clear, well-organized plan, but the section reveals a surprisingly sculptural character, a character that emerges from the intersection of two volumes with parabolic section, a high parabola and a lower wide part. In the courtyard, you can see from the plan, there are several lower parabolic arches. From the outside, you can see that these parabolas in a way warped. In comparison to Brazilian examples with similar curvilinear structures, the frame developed by Guedes offers a very different balance between tectonic meaning and architectural expression. The architect added several beaks, hooks, curves with no structural function. The presence of these curves questions, in a way, Portuguese perspectives in favor of a more expressive African design. So the building acquires an original sensuous Mozambican dimension. And thanks to the use of concrete, it acquires a plasticity comparable only to that expressed in Guedes sculptures. Guedes reinterpreted the so-called modern canon through a total artistic immersion. This cut on the wall is emblematic of his approach, an approach which mixed modern principles and ideas coming from local cultures and led to the development of a mediated grammar of forms. So Guedes also demonstrated a deep understanding of the economy associated with the application of this technique of concrete in Mozambique. In doing so, he moved away from Brazilian and Portuguese examples. On one hand, in Brazil and the Portuguese colonies, reinforced concrete production and construction represented a push for local industrialization and modernization. The adoption of this material, however, contributed to an economy of manual labor exploitation that was low-tech and had often perpetuated class exclusions. Guedes' building activity challenged these aspects. Instead of focusing on mass production and prefabrication, he developed organic shapes which necessitated custom-built, size-specific formwork as opposed to prefabricated pieces. But he also developed a sort of pedagogical project to instruct his employee on the use of the material, and he built long-standing work relationships with the craftsmen of Lourenço Marques. He established, for example, his atelier in his own house, and there he trained local builders employed in his project. But he also encouraged local artists to meet with these builders and create art pieces in this productive, relaxed atmosphere. As an example, together with Julian Baynard, South African architect, Guedes' friend, Guedes conceived a summer workshop for students at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. You probably know the research by Aya Levin on this topic. So the activity was not focused on local craftsmen training, but eventually translated into a complex exchange of knowledge. The first workshop sections took place in '61 in a building in Lourenço Marques, the Pyramidal Kindergarten, which was one of Guedes' projects under construction at that time. The workers involved in the construction joined the students and offered suggestions. They participated with non-academic materials. And Guedes said that, and I'm quoting, they arrived and made for themselves wonderful drawings, much better than those of our students, end quote. Julia Baynard describes the event in details, and again I'm quoting from Baynard. Guedes, who has been attracted by the spontaneous ability of these people, runs an architectural practice using only people whom he has trained himself. In his backyard works a wood carver, whom Guedes found working on a building site, a bricklayer who made murals, the painter Malangatana. Guedes uses some of these people to work with him on his own projects. And the size and quality of the output not only says much for Guedes' creative and inspirational powers, but shows that such teamwork can succeed and that studio technique can be an important educational method in Africa, end quote. This is a clear example of knowledge exchange that, however, needs further examination. Some important details about this exchange, this participation, for example, remain contradictory. On several occasions, Guedes declared his appreciation, his profound respect for the traditions of Mozambique, and numerous episodes in his career demonstrate a very deep concern with less affluent groups in Lourenço Marques. But the emphasis on the idea of educating Africans, in the word of Baynard himself, for example, is high. and dangerously echoes all colonial models of control of the African population, models in which cultural absorption occurred through modernization and education. Guedes' hierarchical division of labor during design and construction also needs further study. Guedes, as many of his contemporary colleagues, Guedes was the master. His black assistants were always relegated to the role of helpers, in a way. Like many other European architects in the African colonies, Guedes held a position of privilege in the country, which affected his architectural production. So his work primarily focused on private houses commissioned by the social and economic elite of Lorenzo Marques, to which Guedes himself belonged. So at the beginning of his career, for example, he designed projects for his family as well as for rich friends. Only after some years, Guedes obtained different kinds of commission. You have some images here: bank agencies, schools, churches. They benefited from a collaboration with the Swiss Mission, another institution with sometimes contradictory ties in the region. So another topic that I would like to study more in details. But I would like to focus on Guedes' interest in Mozambican culture. Guedes has often been included among the tropical architects by traditional historiography. He's mentioned in this famous book by Brian Drew, Tropical Architecture in the Dry and Humid Zones. He certainly showed great interest towards locality in Mozambique. However, he did not seem to seek, try to find the most efficient performance and the best climatic comfort in his buildings. Instead, he attentively read the geographical, topographical, climatic conditions where a given building was built, and he adapted the so-called modern canon that he had learned during his South African and Portuguese education. He adapted this to local traditions, to cultural values. It is important to remember that Guedes began his artistic and architectural education in South Africa at the University of Witwatersrand under a number of exceptional teachers, among them John Fassler. So at that time, scholars at Wits were very interested in Le Corbusier pre-war architecture as a result of his contact, for example, with Rex Martinson, one of John Fassler's partners. By 1945, architects in Johannesburg had built numerous modern buildings in and around the city. However, strongly promoted by Martinson himself, this interest in modern architecture went hand in hand with deep appreciation for local architecture. Designers from Johannesburg, faculty members, students at Wits, they organized expeditions to visit indigenous communities living outside the city. Architectural magazines enthusiastically published articles on what they called the vernacular architecture of the region, drawing connections between this and more modern examples. Guedes enrolled in the School of Architecture in 1945, and he lived firsthand this coexistence of interests. He also experienced the idea conveyed by his teachers that architecture was above all a comprehensive art, able to integrate all the other plastic and design arts. These multiple interests re-emerged later during his life in Mozambique, when Guedes became not only an architect, but a renowned sculptor, also a notable collector of Mozambican art. So you have some examples here. He gathered sculptures, head and body masks for the dance of the Makonde, a tribe at the border between Mozambique and Tanzania. And he bought several sculptures from the Longwe people who live in the northern region. During the 60s and the 70s, he reinterpreted this Mozambican artistic tradition. So as a sculptor, he rethought Mozambican family sculptures. He carved objects like this totem, or like you have an image, the Barco para uma Rainha, in which groups of objects are cut from a single segment of tree, a single trunk, according to Mozambican tradition. Guedes' interest, fascination with Mozambican art and his work with Mozambicans who had no specific training, they can be seen as a way of building bridges between traditions, questioning the bipolarity, the modern vernacular bipolarity I mentioned before. As said, Guedes collected art and supported a network of craftsmen and artists working in his studio. He also developed a system of connections from Lorenzo Marquez that included Africans, Americans, and Europeans. His contacts became very influential, even within the framework of the colonial dictatorship of Portuguese regime. He was able to run as Mozambican representative, for example, at the International Biennale of Art in Sao Paulo in '61. He also participated as a speaker at the inaugural session of the First International Congress of African Culture in '62, a meeting that made history as he praised the art developed in Africa. The events prepared, in a way, Guedes' international debut in the most prestigious European architectural magazines, such as Architectural Review, L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, and later the African Black Orpheus. Guedes developed an important public presence and soon became a key figure in the African network of art patronage, together with Frank McEwen, Holly Bayer, Julian Weiner. He soon became international sponsor, mentor of the local artists, sculptors, poets, and musicians working in his studio. So Bayer wrote that, and I'm quoting, "Visiting his house is like visiting an artist's workshop. Painters, sculptors, and embroiderers are distributed throughout the space. Guedes does not give formal classes, but encourages them, criticizes them, buys them their works, and sometimes provides them with a monthly allowance that allows artists to work full-time without economic concerns." Among the artists that Guedes supported was Malangatana, one of the most important Mozambican artists. Malangatana's relationship with Guedes began in '59, while he was still an amateur painter. He was a servant at the Gremio Civic Club of Lorenzo Market as well. Guedes detected his talent and invited him to move to his studio, where Malangatana spent 3 years working on commission and supported by Guedes. In '61, Guedes organized the first monographic exhibition on Malangatana's work, and this was followed by exhibitions in Cape Town, London, Paris, Nigeria, the US as well. In the '60s, the sudden international projection of Malangatana as a painter, as well as Guedes' own international reputation, led several European and African intellectuals to consider Lorenzo Marquez as one of the main centers of a new Africa, an Africa full of new creative activity. As many other post-war African countries, however, Mozambique was undergoing radical and difficult processes of modernization. These processes were often paired by an increasing urban pressure and the creation of separated, spontaneous slums in the major cities. So in Lorenzo Marquez, the rural population moving to the city lived in precarious conditions in the slum called Canicos from the rates of its construction. Guedes knew this part of the city very well and operated critical and creative research on it. He developed strong criticism of the existing urban framework against the segregation of these neighborhoods. He questioned colonial planning and regulation. He published an article, here you have an example, A Cidade Doente, the Sick City, focus on this topic. Guedes argued for innovative initiatives, such as the need for public housing, that would, in a way, revitalize downtown and, I'm quoting, initiate and accelerate a genuine racial integration, unquote. Guedes published further research on this topic and advocated improvement of the slum and the resettlement in situ. Later in his life, he focused on the local way of carving and painting the doors of slum houses, and he published this writing, 1001 Doors from the Canico, from the slums. Guedes also designed shelters and educational buildings for the population living in the slums and the periphery of Lorenzo Marquez. He often utilized local, low-cost technology. So this is the case that you have here. It's the clandestine nursery school in the Canico, which Guedes designed and helped build in '68-69. The school was made from sticks, reeds, grass, And it was built by the Basque combatant together with unskilled laborers. Colonial administrators, officials, they did not share Guedes' concerns for the slums. As Malangatana recalls, Guedes was heavily attacked for his research, for his design work, and for his publications on the slum. And I'm quoting, even the city council reacted against it. The Portuguese bourgeoisie aligned itself with the official position and also showed its disapproval. But the population of the most degraded areas received Guedes with great joy. So his project in the slum, as well as other buildings, were enthusiastically received by the population. Local inhabitants did enjoy the complex curvilinear structure that I show you of the cycle bakery. They call it the elephant, a Mozambican symbol of strength, intelligence, caring. And it is thanks to this, to his attention to local customs, conditions, practices, that Guedes developed a personal, powerful architecture and art. He designed housing developments like the Smiling Line that you have here, that shows his interest in modern European Brazilian architecture mixed with traditional Mozambican themes that give birth to an original interpretation of a residential building for a capital city. He designed modern villas with high totemic chimneys. Still today, these examples reveal the intensity and dynamism of his work. They also show the transatlantic knowledge exchange epitomized by his work. Like other Portuguese architects, Portuguese immigrants, Guedes produced a very heterogeneous architectural work that engaged with painting and sculpture, as I said. He became especially interested in mural paintings. He was an admirer of the Mexican muralist José Orozco and Diego Rivera. And not by coincidence, Guedes designed several murals in durable, colorful materials for his buildings. This one is the Abreu Santos Aroja, built in Lourenço Marques in 1955. For this project, he designed a large mural made of small pebbles, which interpreted the African imagery of art and craft. He used small flintstone rocks, created a low relief, and its design was inspired by the graphic motif of the capulana, the traditional Mozambique fabric worn by women in the region. In the Casa do Dragão, the House of the Dragon, the mural is located in the entrance gallery, and it is visible from the street. Here it is the mural itself that gives the building its name. So once again, Guedes shows concerns with the multiplicity of traditionals and local means of integration between art and architecture. The mural is executed as a reinterpretation of the calcada portuguesa, the stone paving technique used in Portugal. This extraordinary Mozambican work came to a sudden, abrupt end. The post-war architectural and building activity in Mozambique paused in the mid-70s as a result of the swift military coup that is known as the Portuguese Revolution of '74. The Mozambique War of Independence was a success, but the war itself reduced the number of construction projects in Lourenço Marques, as the revolt strongly encouraged an anti-colonial stance that affected the elite architects to whom Guedes belonged and their main clients. In addition, the dramatic events related to the War of Independence combined with the fact that a brutal dictatorship was ruling Brazil, while in Portugal the transition to democracy proceeded very, very slowly. So the exchange and transfer of knowledge between the three regions, Mozambique, Brazil, and Portugal, shrunk considerably, at least for some years. 1974 is also the year in which Guedes left Lourenço Marques for Johannesburg in South Africa. Many architects were subjected to the 24/20 declaration. They had 24 hours to leave Mozambique with 20 kilograms of belongings, and an event that left them almost penniless. Despite this sudden departure, the legacy left in Mozambique by the work done by Guedes and the other Portuguese architects, immigrants, offers significant, important examples. They are examples of a transcultural and more cosmopolitan approach to architecture, an approach that had to face problems of considerable complexity. These architects had to balance their desire to enlarge their perspectives to local communities, builders, artists, communities in the slums, like Guedes did. They had to balance this desire and their ties with colonial powers or their privileges. So the work that architects like Guedes developed offers an opportunity to discuss these intricacies. It allows us, in a way, to examine the tensions, the incongruities of the last colonial period in Mozambique. And most importantly, their work allows us to investigate the vital forces that shape cities at the periphery of the world and the strategies applied to overcome dominant modernist narratives in these cities. Thank you.
Thank you.
I tried to stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for your really interesting and insightful lecture. I'm going to very briefly introduce Professor Adedoyin Teriba, who took a PhD in the history of modern architecture at Princeton University and currently teaches the history of modern and contemporary architecture and urbanism at Vassar College. Adedoyin works on architecture in the modern era, critical regionalism, modern and contemporary architecture in West Africa, and the intersection between industrial design and modern and contemporary architecture. While Pedro Guedes is a senior lecturer at the School of Architecture at the University of Queensland, and his PhD explored the invention and the innovation in the introduction of iron in buildings of the 19th century. And he is interested in the architectural practices as well as cross-disciplinary collaboration with design and the colonization. Thank you for being here. I leave you the floor.
Okay. Well, just first of all, good day to everybody. I'm very grateful to you, Elisa. Thank you very much for your presentation, to Lena, to Pedro, and to all of you. I learned an incredible amount on this subject of Pancho Guedes. And in many ways, as I was listening to you, Elisa, talk about Pancho Guedes, I thought of another emigre architect, Alan von Richards, the Englishman who lived and worked in Nigeria for a long time. Professor Uduku is on this call, and she has worked on Alan von Richards. And in many ways, it seems to me, in my humble opinion, Pancho differs a little bit in the fact that he spent part of his childhood in Mozambique, and that that sort of intimacy. Yes, Alan von Richards was married to a Nigerian woman, but there's a way in which Pancho Guedes, because of his child, it seems to me he brought a kind of childlike experience to his engagement with Mozambican customs, visual, which I'll more about later on in this response, his response to visual motifs, visual iconography in Mozambique. And so there's a way in which I want to sort of hover as I talk about this, and this is one of the questions and things to consider that I want to sort of broach with you, Elisa, is you talk about, you know, a cultural bridge between cultures in Pancho Guedes' architecture. You talk about his status as an outsider emigre. You talk about his privilege, and you allude to his Black assistants. You mentioned some of them, and I would like to hear more about his exchange with builders. And so in your presentation, you show artists. He had, his work transcended genres, architecture, sculpture. He was an artist himself. And your presentation talked some about some builders. I don't want to butcher their names. John Fundi, you mentioned in the presentation, and some other people, but I'm interested in to what extent, even with the publication on doors, that exhibit that you showed, and even his pictures and drawings about certain structures in certain communities in Mozambique. Can you talk more about to what extent he engaged with builders in Mozambique, if you know that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's actually what I was hoping to work on traveling there, right? It's very difficult to find material about this. I have some descriptions by others who were present during some of the events you're interested in and you're asking me about. But then the hope was to actually travel there and have some first-hand interviews or have the possibility to talk with these builders when it comes to projects built in concrete. And there is an entire tradition there I talked about, but also when it comes to projects that are in more ephemeral materials, grass, wood, and things like that, in the canicos. It would be wonderful to actually know more about this relationship. I think it's central in this kind of discourse, especially when we talk about exchanges of knowledge and connections. At this point, I have what I show you. I apologize. But I hope to find more. It's a very complex topic, a little bit difficult to investigate further from here.
Yes. Well, yes, so something to consider, and at least for me, it seems to get partly to the heart of the number of examples of the architecture of emigres in the continent that one saw in the middle of the 20th century, in the latter half of the 20th century. And what I'm talking about in particular is the way in which in Guedes' work, in the work of somebody like an Alan Vaughan Richards, you see this commitment to using visual motifs of local cultures as a launching point to clad certain buildings, whether it's the wall screens or what have you, with a sort of visual language that is an homage. Maybe that is not the word I'm looking for, but I will stick with that word, to some sort of local sensibility. But well, nothing beyond that. And what I'm thinking about in particular is to what extent do some of these emigre architects really look at the technologies of local building traditions and engage with that, either through entering into workshops with local artisans, which is why I asked you the question about artisans, because it seems to me that whenever, and again, I stand to be corrected on this, but it seems to me that whenever one sees the architecture of a Pancho Guedes or just some of the other, you made just you made a little nod to Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew in your presentation, that it tends to be sort of superficial in terms of wall screens and certain elements of these buildings. But I guess where I'm going with this sort of, it's more of a comment than a question, but that sort of engagement, this cultural exchange, never goes beyond the visual. And I mean, Guedes, it seems to me, had this strong inclination to sculpture, so it makes all sort of sense. But I wonder if it's even worth posing the question, the ways to which whether Guedes, whether you're going to unearth that in Guedes' studies of, local structures, of creating, you talked about the clandestine nursery school that he built in 1968, 1969. Did he observe local building traditions? Did he take inspiration for those building traditions? Because oftentimes those traditions do lead to some of the visual forms that we see. And so you can't separate technology from visual form, the architectural forms. And so to what extent did, perhaps in his drawings, and did he study the building technologies of some of these local builders? And so it's more of a comment than a question, but if you can respond, please respond.
Well, I can say that there are photos about this particular project you mentioned. There are plans, but there are no details drawing, or not that I know, or not that I'm aware of. Maybe Pedro knows a little bit more about this project, but it's this kind of question that I'm trying, or that I would like to answer as well. It's my impression that it's not only an interest in the sculptural presence of architecture in Guedes, and it's not that he's trying to replicate these visual motifs because he's fascinated. In comparison to other emigres, I see a more ingrained commitment in a way. Not sure if it is in techniques or in technology, but there are these examples that make me hopeful in a way. Anna Leroux was here, and now she's not in. I don't know if she's still there, but she talks about the the skin of the buildings in this African context, reacting to the climate. But at the end, it's only an additional layer, and they are the canonical modernist buildings, internationalized, right? I think that in Guedes there is something slightly different that needs to be investigated. Again, it's not simply fascination with the visual in this case. But again, I need to work more on this topic. Thanks for this question.
Thank you so much. Could you talk about the history of architectural education, if you can, in Mozambique? To what extent, I wonder if, it's been, as you said, just a place where, Portuguese architects who were more constrained in Portugal, just, in many ways, Mozambique became a place where ideas could be tested and what have you. So I guess sort of the comment / question I'm trying to raise is, to what extent did Guedes have an impact on the local instruction of architecture? I saw in your picture of Guedes' studio that there were draftspeople, black draftsmen working in the background. So he had an impact in publishing, and there's a way he was an educator, in his office, in print form. But could you talk about, if you know, sort of the institutional, what I mean by institutional, university climate, architectural education in Mozambique, and to what extent he had a role or not in that?
So I show you the workshops he developed together with, in collaboration with WITS in South Africa. I'm not aware of the on the level of his involvement with Mozambican institutes. I know he was one of the first architects in the area, together with other immigrants, and I know that he was very, very interested in collaborating with local craftsmen, artists, and builders. And it seems that there was no real disciplinary boundaries between these disciplines, which is very, very interesting. But yeah, maybe this is another topic to discuss, to investigate. So if there was an institutional side to this pedagogical research in Mozambique. I know that there was a side in South Africa, as I said, in Johannesburg. I'm not aware if this was part of a project in Mozambique as well.
Yeah, as you were just talking, I was just, I remembered the part of your presentation where it was a sentence, you mentioned Nigeria, the fact that he displayed work in Nigeria and he was published by Uli Bayer, the German, and I'm just reminded of the workshops of Bayer in Nigeria, his engagement with Nigerian artists. And yes, I mean, I think there's no doubt that the workshop setting was a form of, building up a kind of architectural, sculptural culture. It seems that in Guedes' case, that he, in those workshop centers were more for the sculptural side as opposed to the architectural side. I don't know, but just this is what I'm getting the sense of. But I think so. I think I will close with a question on just bringing in Brazil into this equation. In the middle of the 20th century in Nigeria, for instance, there was a sort of cultural exchange where prominent Black Brazilians, including soccer players, were going to Southwest Nigeria. There were publications by a Brazilian journalist, Antonio Olinto, on the Africa, former slaves and the descendants of former slaves who settled in Southwest Nigeria. And so I think my question to you is, was there a sort of Black Portuguese diasporic presence that coincided with Guedes' time in Mozambique? And for instance, were there Black Brazilian artists too who dialogued with Guedes, who were part of the sort of architectural and artistic culture that Guedes was a part of as well? Was there something similar, in other words?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, thanks. This is a great question. I know that Malangatana was in contact with artists in Brazil. And I don't know the extent to which this connections also involve Guedes. The entry point that I tried to use was Portugal. So I tried to understand if Guedes' Portuguese origins, let's say, his period of studies in Portugal influence in a way his way of reading Brazilian architecture as Brazilian architecture arrived in Portugal. But this idea of considering direct relations with Brazil is very interesting, and I think I will try to pursue as soon as possible. It opens an entirely new chapter of questions about this research, right? I know that there are some scholars working on this topic, not specifically on Guedes, but on the direct relations between Brazil and the African colonies. And it will be very nice to connect with the scholars and develop the topic further.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'll yield the floor back to Lena. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry I didn't have so many answers or so clear answers. It's a work in progress.
Just raising questions for you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for these, I think, very interesting questions that will probably, extend the measure of this research. I think so. So I think these inputs and also this question puts in evidence some kind of methodological, new aspect in how to make a research. I think I'm an architect, so I'm not an historian, but I think that these inputs, like this methodological input, have a great impact also on my research, and of sure in the research of many other scholars that are following and will watch this lecture. So really thank about that. There are some, I mean, I would have some other question. I'm not expert, of course, on this aspect, but yeah, maybe in the end I will ask Elisa something else. I leave the floor to Pedro Guedes, and I'm sure that he will enlighten us on much more aspects. Thank you.
Unmuting. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I really enjoyed your talk, and there are a lot of interesting avenues that you've opened. Some of them I may be able to help you with answers. I do have a large digital archive of Pancho's stuff because I did that very big exhibition in Lisbon. Mm-hmm. And I'm very happy to share it with anyone who is interested. Yes. And you know, I mean, just write to me, and I'll send it in bits and pieces. There are things that are published, things that are unpublished, and lots of images. I mean, one of the things that is interesting about Pancho, I mean, I'm speaking personally because I'm his son, and it's quite difficult for me to kind of have some objective distance. But one of the things that a lot of historians or people looking at his work try to do is they try to find some order or some logic to it. And one of the things about Pancho is that he always avoided that because he clothed himself in multiple identities. I mean, he claimed to be many different people, and so he celebrated this in his architecture because he would he claimed to have 25 styles of architecture that he could turn on at the drop of a hat. But he was really very, very interested in some of the points that you raised in your questions, Adedoye, because he really was very keen on building with local materials, with local people. The thing, you know, those kinds of buildings do not have conventional documentation. They are built by word of mouth, and they are also built by improvisation. There's particularly in the squatter settlements in the Caniço in Lourenço Marques, that you know, nobody knew what materials were going to be available. Some of the windows and bits and pieces for that nursery school were from demolition sites donated and adapted to the thing. The materials used were the kind of reeds that the rest of the squatter settlement was built out of, including thatched roofs. I mean, I think that was, but Pancho actually has two other projects that he published that were to do with building with such materials, and they were both religious buildings. They were for churches. I mean, Pancho was great at avoiding tax. He didn't pay tax to the Portuguese government, or at least he'd signed declarations on his word of honor that he hadn't made any money. And but he gave back any organization that came to him wanting a church, a club, or a school that wasn't an official school. He'd do the work for free, and he documented. And one of his big clients was the Swiss mission, Calvinist mission, that actually had a presence in Mozambique, in parts of Mozambique, long before the Portuguese occupied the territory. And one of the Swiss missionaries was a guy called Junot, who was an anthropologist and a missionary, who was who looked at the people in the area that Malangatana people come from. And he wrote about them, and he wrote about their building technologies and all that kind of thing. He published the work. It's easily available. You can get it on archive.com. The English translation is a story of an African tribe. But he did. So Pancho was always interested in building with these things, but there were very few outlets. First of all, this kind of building was illegal in any kind of occupiable part of in any organized part of the city. It had to be done in rural areas or in areas that weren't under the control of the municipality or hadn't been zoned by the municipality. So they were precarious parts of the city, and many of those parts were subject to flooding and all that kind of thing. So they were subject to natural disasters. He did do a study of buildings in those peripheral areas of cities in Mozambique that was published, I think, by Paul Oliver in Shelter in Africa. He went throughout the, and you had one image from that book in your story, but there are two churches that he designed using thatched materials, and they were to some extent quite innovative in terms of idea, because they departed from the kind of conventional church plan and stuff like that. They were conceived of. One of them was conceived of as a circular building with people sitting around in much the same way as settlements in that part of Africa are organized traditionally. And the other one was what he called the Cathedral of Huts, which is where each family had a separate little building that then that connected with the main area. So he always dreamt of doing those things, but the prestige of permanent cement buildings was so great. I mean, people aspired to them, and quite often something that had started off as a grass idea ended up as a concrete building. But in some of with the Swiss mission, you showed an image of a school at Antioquia, which was built out of cement blocks and very simple roof trusses. And that building was built by builders who were totally illiterate. So all the drawings that Pancho did were done without any writing on them. They were just drawings of the blocks so that the builder could count the blocks. And these builders were absolutely perfect builders. They built buildings like they were making a Swiss watch. I mean, they'd been trained by these crazy missionaries, Calvinist missionaries, and so so there was that kind of engagement with technology. But the buildings in the city in Lourenço Marques were very the building regulations were incredibly prescriptive. In fact, the building regulations in Mozambique were identical to the building regulations in Lisbon. So that they were actually, the regulations were for a seismic zone, and there were no earthquakes in Mozambique. So, it was just part of the regularization of the empire that had happened. But look, your point about Pancho being very visual is a well observed, and I think an accurate idea. I mean, Pancho, when he went to university, for about 6 months, he pretended to his parents that he was doing something useful, but he was actually studying art. He was then persuaded to do architecture. So he had a strong kind of artistic bent. But he also had I think that I'm actually doing a paper on some of these subjects. He did straddle several Western architectural cultures. The culture at the University of the Witwatersrand was very, very active because of Martinsson and people from that generation. And there were lots of when he was a student, there were lots of people who had been in the South African forces who'd come back to South Africa. So they'd been to Italy, to Japan. Some of them had been prisoners in Japan. One of his the teachers that he most admired had been captured by the Japanese. So there was that world, and that connected, and there were several people who were very much connected with British architectural journals. But he finished rather slowly. He took a long time to complete his qualifications at Wits. But he couldn't practice in Mozambique because nobody was allowed to practice as an architect in Mozambique unless they had a Portuguese degree. So he had to go to Portugal to get his degree in architecture, which was done in the Beaux-Arts tradition. I mean, he had to produce a design for a hospital in I think kind of 12 hours, and then or 24 hours in a room with a chamber part, and then he had to elaborate it over some time. So he came back with his degree from Portugal, and when he was in Portugal, he met some people there. So there was that connection as well. But actually, something quite interesting, that the building you showed of the Saipal Bakery with its parabolic arrangement was actually something that in Mozambique, steel for concrete was very expensive. And that building, the engineer on that building was an Italian engineer called Vitale Moffa, who had been captured by the South Africans in Abyssinia. He was part of the Italian civilian occupation of Abyssinia, building roads, and a very excellent engineer. And his ship, he was being brought to South Africa as a prisoner, but his ship was torpedoed near Mozambique, and he ended up in a neutral country and practiced engineering. I mean, and there were quite a number of them. I mean, he actually taught my father how to make fake travertine. So there were these crazy technologies coming from various places into Mozambique. And actually, those spikes that you mentioned, Elise, on the outside of the Saipal building, those were actually an improvised device to mask the reinforcing rods that were getting ready for the extension to the building. So because he believed he had to finish the building in some way, so that it wouldn't look like it had been mutilated, you know. So he kind of, yeah. So you know, that was that sort of situation. But I think I read an article by you about the South African scene, and you mentioned people like Betty Spence, who was interested in the Ndebele people and all that. And actually, one of the things that unites South Africa, or people in the milieu in Johannesburg and at Wits, with Brazil was this connection was this idea of valuing vernacular architectures. I mean, people like Lucia Costa were very keen on looking at the origins of Portuguese colonial architecture. In South Africa, there was a lot of interest in kind of various vernacular architectures, including lots of indigenous architectures. There were many traditions there because of several layers of colonial stuff. So yes, Pancho's background was quite complicated, and then he connected with through Theo Crosby, who'd been one of those returned servicemen who I think he'd known in Johannesburg before Theo went back to the UK. It went to the UK, and Theo Crosby actually worked with Maxwell Fry and those people before he left to be in architectural design. But you know, so there were all these kind of connections, and I think he really did enjoy the connections with Team 10. For him, it was quite interesting because he was an outsider to that. He wasn't part of any kind of complex European politics in that milieu. He was like the Joker at the Team 10 meetings, and they really did like him there. But you know, so that's interesting. I mean, he also developed a very close relationship with Uli Baya and people in Nigeria. But that Congress in Harare, Salisbury at the time, organized by Frank McEwen, the first International Congress of African Culture, was actually quite an interesting event. It happened at a time when people had a lot of hope for Africa. It was at the time of the Bandung Conference, non-alignment, all that kind of thing. And then very quickly, all that kind of closed up. But I mean, going back to your point about the visual side of things, a couple of the participants in that, one of the participants at that Congress was Alfred Barr, one of the earliest directors of the Museum of Modern Art. I mean, he'd come back, and there was Roland Penrose, a British surrealist, and Tristan Zara. And basically what those guys were doing was that they were connecting, they were trying to find a connection with the spirit of African art that had galvanized, that had changed the visual arts, the plastic arts of European Cubism, Picasso and those people, you know. So there were all these funny connections. But again, on the Brazilian issue, Pancho decided to participate in the Biennale that you mentioned in your talk, and the participation there was actually an undercover participation. He convinced the local director of the tourism department for it to be an official representation. If you look in there is I think it's still online. There is a catalog of participants in the Brazilian archives, and it's and the people who are sponsoring Pancho are the Delegação do Turismo de Mozambique or something like that. And the Portuguese government was furious that that he'd gone to Brazil representing Mozambique, because to them it was not Mozambique, it was Portugal, and it was just a little province, you see. So 2 years later, there was a discussion about the next participation of Mozambique, and Elisa, I'll send you a full page from the Tribuna magazine newspaper about people discussing why they weren't participating in the some people were participating, some people weren't participating. They couldn't say why they weren't participating because that would be kind of treacherous, but because Portuguese newspapers at the time were censored. I mean, everything had to be anything written that was going to be published had to go to the censor commission. So that big spread you did that you showed of Pancho's article on the Caniço was actually subversively passed through the censors by having parts of it shown to them, and then they worked out who would be on duty, so they'd show another part to somebody else. So they had no idea of what the whole thing would be like, and so it got through. So in the end, quite a few people didn't want to participate in the Biennale because there was this idea of they wanted to represent Mozambique rather than represent a small province of Portugal. Look, I don't know if I've spoken too long or whether I mean that's at all interesting, but I'd be very happy to help anyone who's looking into this stuff,
Thanks, Pedro. This is amazing. Yes, and I would love to continue this conversation. I have a feeling that I have a lot to learn from you about this.
Well, actually, look, there's I could also put you in touch with other people. I've been there's a woman who's doing a doctorate at the ETH in Zurich, and she's actually looking at the Swiss mission side of things and how that. I mean, the Swiss mission is really interesting because all the people who ended up in the liberation movement, in the leadership of the liberation movement, actually went through the Swiss mission, including Eduardo Mondlane, the original leader of Frelimo, who was assassinated. So, there's a kind of, and Mozambique is a place full of very weird contradictions. I mean, I think Pancho was he was a romantic kind of dreamer, and he had no idea. I mean, he was from a privileged background. His family ended up in Mozambique because his great uncle had been exiled to Mozambique because he had moved from Portugal to Brazil and had tried to. He'd been involved in a revolution in Brazil that was then suppressed by Vargas in the 30s, and he was going to be imprisoned in Portugal because he was thrown out of Brazil. But my grandmother, who I never met, interceded with the powers in Portugal. So my great uncle was exiled to Mozambique and spent his life as a very successful lawyer, living in a luxury hotel. So those were the contradictions. But it was a very strange place, totally crazy. And when I first went to Portugal, I was amazed at how primitive Portugal was compared to what I'd experienced in Lourenço Marques, because it was. I think part of the reason for Lorenzo Marx being such a beautiful city, at least in the parts that were built out of concrete, was that it was a sort of a propaganda piece to show the South Africans and other colonial powers that the Portuguese were actually good, the Portuguese overseas provinces were really wonderful places.
Okay, I think that thank you very much, above all, Pedro, for your consideration. And I think that we have more questions from Ola Uduku. If you wanna ask something more.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Elias. I thought that was a really good introductory lecture. And hello, Pedro. As I said, I'm in touch with you via Ian Jackson. I think this is a really interesting area. And again, we don't hear, I don't think we hear enough about your dad. And it would be great, actually. I'm throwing this out to you now, Pedro. We'd love to have you give a lecture, but it's great that we have people.
Hey, Ola, I'd be delighted to do a lecture. In fact, the first lecture I did on my father was, I'd always been reluctant to do it, but I was invited by Hugo Segawa at USP, and I gave a lecture there. And it's a very personal lecture, but I'd be very happy to do it. And I'd be
great now that we're all online. But just focusing on Elisa's really good introduction, I think there's some really interesting parts she highlights. And indeed, as Adedoyin Teriba, my country person, I'm Nigerian as well, says, I think this issue about, I guess it would be diaspora architects in some ways, and how they link with countries like Mozambique is interesting. But because we don't know enough, I think, about Lusophone Africa and its links both back to Portugal, but importantly also back to Brazil, that intersection becomes very, very important to explore in more detail, because it's something that, we hear about these things. And I think I've just put into the box as well, the conference in, I think, what was then Salisbury, so is now Harare, becomes critical to our understanding of this. Because see from the West African side, we know all about Yolivera, and we do know also that some of the so-called modernists do move on to mainly Southern Africa. So there's a discussion around how that happens. But importantly, I think in terms of the discussion about Mozambique and your father or Pancho Guedes, is that link also to Brazil, which again is often not really explored in great detail. I mean, there is that, I can understand the background around Mozambique not having its own architects at the time and people having to go back to Portugal. But, what's that intersection between those who go on to Brazil and those who, I guess, develop their architecture in Mozambique? Although, I mean, I guess the leading question is a lot of them then go down to South Africa, but it would be good to explore that in more detail.
Well, the issue about, you see, there was no training in architecture in Mozambique until after independence. You couldn't get a degree in architecture in Mozambique. Pancho actually did teach at a technical college as a kind of voluntary night school for people to learn drafting and stuff like that. But that was the extent of any technical education in the field of architecture. People had to go to Portugal. You see, the Portuguese, one of the characteristics of the Portuguese colonial empire was that the Portuguese were terrified of these overseas provinces becoming economically viable and independent in their own right. I mean, it was actually illegal in Mozambique for anyone to do prospecting. Right. So if you look at any maps of mineral stuff in Southern Africa from the time that the Portuguese were there, all the mineral stuff ends at the border. And I as a kid, I knew of geologists who got thrown out of the country for doing clandestine prospecting. So and for a very long, I mean, the economy of Mozambique at the time that I was there was actually dependent on the export of labor to the South African mines, right? There was also a poll tax, which required people to pay tax in cotton, so that people were forced to farm cotton. The cotton was then sent to Portugal, and the price was fixed. They couldn't sell the cotton on the open market. Send the cotton to Portugal, and it would come back as cloth for people to buy. So it was a kind of very primitive sort of 18th century economy. And so that was an interesting side to it. But there's I'd be very happy to kind of talk to any group of people with lots of images and stuff like that of all this stuff.
Thank you. Anything about the links to Brazil that you?
Oh yeah. Look, on Brazil. Look, my I'll tell you how the Brazilian thing worked, and it's a very circuitous thing. My mother, Dori Guedes, worked when she was a student with my father in Johannesburg. She worked at a bookshop, the only kind of interesting bookshop in Johannesburg, run by, it was called Vanguard Booksellers, and it was run by a Lithuanian refugee Jewish lady called Fanny Kleineman. And she was connected with literary circles in France and New York. And she was really good at getting any publications about architecture. In fact, she would suggest publications for my father, and she organized all the subscriptions to journals from France, from the US, from Britain. But she also connected Pancho to a journal that was published by Oscar Niemeyer in Brazil, and I can't remember its name. I think it might be called Projeto, but there were 3 or 4 very important Brazilian journals at the time, and I think he did end up corresponding with Niemeyer's daughter, but they were very tenuous things, and he did visit Brazil in 1960, 61, I think it was. So I think you showed an image of a photograph taken by him. He was interested in that, and then he was also interested in people in Portugal that he connected with. That there was a guy called Fernando Távora, who was to some extent connected with Lucio Costa in some way. So there were these sort of informal connections. I mean, Elisa, you showed an image of all those people sitting outside a congress of some official thing that had been done in Portugal related to Brazilian architecture. You see, that is a typical image of the official face of the Portuguese system, where there'd be a kind of a press photograph of all the delegates and all that, because that actually showed that it was very cozy and international. But actually, there were these kind of really interesting undercurrents that were happening on this. Another very interesting person, Elisa, if you've managed to get to Mozambique and he's still alive, is a guy called José Forjás, who he was. I remember him working in my father's office. He was actually doing military service in Mozambique, and he took me aside and he wanted to tell me a secret, and he said, Pedro, I must tell you this. You've been kind of skeptical about me being in the army, because I told him that I was going to leave Mozambique to avoid going into the army. And he said, look, I'm in the army because I'm a member of the Portuguese Communist Party, and they have ordered me to be in the army. So he was building bridges and stuff like that in the north of Mozambique. Part of and on one occasion, one of the bridges that he built, it got blown up, and there was a note on the bridge saying that we've inspected this bridge and it was not suitable for the future Mozambique. So there were kind of events like that, but José Forjage eventually ended up practicing in Swaziland, and then after Mozambique became independent, he became a minister in the reconstruction, and so he has a lot of really interesting knowledge from the kind of the dark days of the revolution, because Mozambique went through a very, very tricky period of extreme panic and adaptation to, because the people in Frelimo had no idea that it was all going to happen so quickly, that the revolution was actually done by military officers in Portugal. They rebelled against the government and took over. And actually, the interesting thing about them is that I think it's the only military coup that's ever happened where the promise that they made on the day they made the coup was actually fulfilled, because they said within 1 year we're going to have elections, and that's what happened. So
very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Look, I've enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you, Pedro. It's been wonderful to hear.
Thank you. I don't know if people have something else to ask. I would just have the chance to say something like it's about what Adedoyin talked about. He talked about the experience of workshop and the experience of pedagogy as something that can improve and something that should be investigated maybe more, not just in this case, maybe in from historians in general. But I think that this implication now with the local workshop and local practitioner and artisan and builders is something that architects tend to deny, or probably because architects think that it's natural, and is also something that they probably try to take like an objective distance, like take the distance from the object of my work, the object of so I think that it's really difficult for a historian to investigate these aspects, but it's something, of course, really interesting to make a good discourse. And also, I think that looking at these buildings, apart from these figurative references, probably still emerge some aspects of the modernism. Of course, Elisa can deny me, or Pedro, but the lines of this architecture, I think, that are very frequent in other architecture, maybe in Rome. Here we have buildings very similar to those that you showed, these as an example of this social and social housing, social collective housing. So beyond these local roots of this architecture, I think that there is something like the main principles of the modernism within it.
Can I enter here? Yeah, look, I think that some of the personalities that Pancho had were directly created to deal with that aspect of working in conversations with people that he couldn't be in the same room with. So there is a style of architecture which he has, which grew out of kind of conversations that he never had with Louis Kahn. You know, and he liked Louis Kahn's pyramids, so he did several buildings that were celebrating that idea. I mean, he also had conversations with dead architects. He liked the idea of talking to Palladio. So you know, so he would have these conversations mainly with himself, but it would be a dialogue, which is an old literary tradition that exists. I think a Renaissance thing, but it was quite common in Portugal and Spain. The idea of people writing something which was a dialogue between two opposing positions.
If I may add something about my own interests, let's say, it's important to me to make evident other connections. We can talk about the interest in modernism or the roots of this interest, but it's important also to acknowledge different kind of agencies, at least for me right now. And this is what I'm trying to do in my work. It's obviously very difficult. It's difficult to find material in the archives, to find witnesses that can talk about what happened, especially when we are focused on the construction site or how things were actually built or how knowledge was transferred from the architect to other actors of the construction. Yet I think it's important to discuss about these topics. So this is what I'm trying to do. It's as I said, this is really at the beginning, but Pedro was very nice, and I hope that this could be the beginning of a conversation to discuss more about these topics.
You're welcome.
May I interject?
Yep.
May I say, are there any builders who built with your father Pedro who are still alive?
Look, the only person who would really know the answer to that is José Forjage. I think he is either in Maputo or in Lisbon. I know that he had he had cancer and it was in remission. I saw him in 2000 at Christmas last year, 2020, before we got overwhelmed by COVID. But he would know about that. Look, one of the reasons why Pancho built many buildings, or had the opportunity to build many buildings, was because buildings were really one of the few outlets for any capital that people had accumulated. So it was a way to kind of build something that you could rent out and that kind of thing. And there were Portuguese builders in Mozambique who were really excellent builders. So they would run very small building firms, but they were very, very accomplished builders who and one of the things that I after I studied architecture, I lived in England and I built quite a number of buildings there. And one of the things that struck me about the difference between Mozambique and an advanced economy like Britain at the time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was that the different technologies that you could use in Mozambique were incredibly limited. They were to do with reinforced concrete frames, infill out of blockwork, really simple stuff. And and there were very few imported materials as well, because so there were really good joinery works that would make excellent joinery for windows and stuff like that. Pancho was allergic to aluminium. Aluminium did invade Mozambique in the mid 60s, but he actually convinced banks and important clients that using aluminium was an absolute cop-out, and he would do everything using local materials. But these builders were incredibly skilled at operating within that limited building tradition, which was similar to the buildings in Portugal, but with less materials available. And I've got one complete set of working drawings that he produced for a house, which is now the residence of the Dutch ambassador to Mozambique. But that's the only kind of record that exists. But I could send you that, Elisa, just so that you could see how it's kind of very kind of accurate and meticulously worked out. I mean, that's at the high end of the production. Other kinds of buildings would be much more informal in the way they were built. There'd be some basic drawings at a scale of 8 scale or 1 to 100. And then a lot of the details would be resolved on the wall by sketching and improvising as things went along. And because people were in a very, very limited building technology, it was actually quite easy for people to understand how to do things within the limits of that way of building.
Yeah, I perfectly understand what you are talking about. I was lucky to visit the construction site of an architect in Mali, Fabrizio Carola. He was an Italian immigrant there. He built several hospitals he used an old Nubian tradition. It's a long story, but anyway, he worked with local builders, and he was used to draw in the morning, discuss with them with paper and pencil on the site, and there were no words. They were talking about what was supposed to happen that day, and the next day the process started again with a new piece of paper, pencil, and drawing together and discussing together what was going to happen. So I perfectly understand the problem about working drawings that you're mentioning.
It seems Alan Kane has a question about the UWC Waterford College in Swaziland, I think.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, look,
Please.
look, that school. I was in the first group of students who went to that school. It was actually set up as a protest against the apartheid regime, because the guy who was the headmaster of the school had run a school in Johannesburg that was a black school in Johannesburg, and the way the South African apartheid regime worked is that it had a legislation which was called the Group Areas Act, which actually excluded people from certain areas. So they used planning as a way of segregating communities. So suddenly, this school, which had been a mission school in a Johannesburg suburb, was now a non-conforming use, and so it became a white school. So Michael Stern, the head of that school, actually decided to set up a multiracial school in an adjoining country, Swaziland, which was a British protectorate between Mozambique and South Africa. And my mother decided that she saw an article about this in a newspaper, and she wrote to Michael Stern, said, "Look, we really like your idea of the school. Pancho will design it for you." So he'd already had a designer lined up, and my father eventually met this guy. He was a guy called I forget his name, but he ended up in prison, and he didn't know. So my father ended up doing. His name was Arthur Goldwright, and he ended up in the Rivonia. He was going to be in the Rivonia trial, but he escaped. But the school was built, and the first part of it was completed in 1963, and I was one of the founder students. My father did the job as a kind of as a free project, and we used to the curriculum was a regular curriculum, but 2 afternoons a week we worked on the buildings. So all the students in the school worked on kind of doing laboring jobs on the building as part of the building process. And so it was actually the first multiracial English medium school in Southern Africa. And Nelson Mandela sent his son by his first marriage to the school. Both his daughters went there. Desmond Tutu sent his son there. And Seretse Khama, the first Prime Minister of Botswana, also sent his son, who's now the Prime Minister of Botswana, to that school. I mean, it is, it's grown, it's kind of changed, but it's still there. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks very much. Both of my children studied there, and I knew that Pancho Guedes had designed the school, so I was interested in a little bit your story about that. I'm based in Luanda, Angola, and I worked with José Forjaz over the years, so I'm very interested in. I unfortunately missed the presentation that Elisa made because the time on the invitation was for 2 o'clock, which is 14 hours our time, which was an hour ago. So I missed probably the first hour, but I hope Elisa can share that with me. So thanks very much.
I think there will be some recordings that could be accessed in the future.
Yeah, for sure. We will have some recordings, I think, in the next days or in the next weeks. So you can, of course, watch all this beautiful discussion. I really thank you all for that.
So
I leave you. Yeah, please.
Lena, what am I looking at behind me in that photograph? Is that some incomplete?
In my photograph?
Yeah. Incomplete heating system under the floor or something like that?
Yeah,
or?
Sure. Yes, exactly. It's a project that I'm working on, and it's just a picture.
Okay.
I'm finishing it, hopefully soon.
Okay. Well, good luck.
Thank you very much about that. I hope that we can have a second round of this lecture maybe when Elisa will finish all her research. And good luck about it.
Thanks. I have a feeling that it will take a little bit of time, but I'm hoping for it to be more complete than this.
Okay, great. Bye-bye to all.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Pedro.
Thank you very much.
Alfredo, and
Thank you.
Ciao a
Thank you.
tutti.
Such a pleasure.
ciao.
Ciao.